Works for me.
Does it work for you? Are you sure it works for you?
I am not sure that it works for me, but I am just a pup.
This is Barely Furcasting, featuring Taebyn, an Injured Nerves audio production. Hi, well, welcome to Barely Furcasting. I am Barely Normal, and you are?
My name is Taebyn. I am a pup. Bark, bark. And I hope all you furs are doing great. Also, how are you? I can't hear you, so I hope you're great.
So today we have a very special guest. We have Kyell Gold joining us very
Yes.
shortly. We're going to spend a majority of our podcast talking with Kyell. Before we go into that,
Yes.
everybody needs to know how the tail is.
Ah, yes. Yes, I'm sure all you furs are on the edge of your seat to know how the tail is gone this week. So I saw a squirrely out there, and so I went. I just did what I did last time. I just kind of walked up calmly, so I didn't scare him away that way like the first time, you might remember. And then I went up and pet his tail like he let me do last time. And last time, you might remember what happened was then immediately I ran off and started chasing my tail and at him, and that scared him off, I think. So this time I pet tail, and then I assured him it was okay, and I just slowly started chasing tail, slowly. And then I went around once and then looked and made sure he was okay. He was still confused, but he stayed there, and that was great. And then I pet his tail again, and then I tried it again one more, and then he kind of got the idea. He kind of went around slowly and cautiously at his tail, and that was exciting. And I didn't want to give him too much all at once, so I left him with that. And I said, practice, and I'll see you later. So I'm excited to, and then I went and practiced chasing my own tail a few times just to make sure I still had the technique down, and I did. So yeah, we'll see. I'm excited to meet up with Squirrely this next week and see how he's doing.
All right. Well, that's good to know. So I have another question for you. Have you watched any other television this week? I've been catching up on F is for Family.
Oh, I haven't heard that.
That is not a PG-13 cartoon.
It's
It's
okay. Good to
it's
know. It
not.
is not a pup 13.
It is not a Pup 13. It is definitely an NC-17.
New Cow 17. Not a pup 13, but a new cow 17. Okay, good.
It's on Netflix, and Bill Burr is the star and producer of the show. It's about this poor guy that lives in the 70s, and he's got a family, and he works for a really chintzy little airport and airlines, and he just gets put upon all the time.
Put upon, but it's good. You like it?
I like it. Every once in a while, it's they do something, and you go, "Oh my God, did they just do that?
Oh my
Oh my cow,
cow!
did they just do that?"
Interesting. We'll see if I get Brave Pup or not on that. I have. Let's see. I'm still continuing on second season of the Goldbergs. It's still really good. I finished the first season of Space Force
Oh,
yesterday.
you finished the whole first season. Wow.
Yep.
Oh, good for you.
No, it's great. It's like really good. I tweeted about this too the other day. And there's not a second season. And I looked and they don't know when that's going to happen because, of the state of affairs right now. But also they haven't been officially renewed yet. But I mean, it's so good. They're going to get they've got to get renewed.
I did read today that the next season of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina is the last season.
Oh,
They're not going to do any more after this part 4, they call it. So I want to point out that we're not doing the 5-minute furs for fun this week because we're going to spend a lot of time talking with Kyell, and we probably won't have a math story or a story time today.
but next week.
Look forward to next week's podcast where we will have, I believe it's Cord Kitty.
Cord Kitty next week.
And the week after that will be Rucus Croax. I think that's how she says her last name, but I'm not sure.
Yes, I'm looking forward to both those too. That'll be really exciting.
Joining us today is Kyell Gold. Welcome, Kyell.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
This is very exciting. I wag all over the place, and it's pure gold that you're with us here today.
I love to inspire wags. I hope to do however I can.
Well, I love to wag, so I think this is going to work out to be a great relationship we got going on here.
It already is.
It already is. And it's just started. I met you at FC 2018.
Okay.
And actually, I thought it was AC 2018, but I just looked because you signed one of my books and you signed it FC 2018. So you didn't know it, but just today, you corrected my almost lie.
That's one reason I put the convention on the books when I signed them, so that we can all remember which convention it was.
They blur after a while.
They really do.
I actually met your husband first. I went in to see you in the dealer's den, say hi, and you weren't there. You were off doing other things, gallivanting like you do, I guess. But I talked to him for a while, and he did not say any bad things about you. In fact, he only said good things about you. And I want you to know he did not pay me to say that just now. So that's the honest truth.
Well, he's good. He's far too good, but he agreed to marry me anyway, so I'm thankful for that every day.
Well, Taebyn, do you have some questions? I know you have a bunch of questions that you
I
want to talk to Kyell
I
about.
do. I'm going to jump like a pup because I'm a pup. Oh, and I have to say on the book, I was looking at it and you wrote, because I'm a pup, it turns out, you said and wrote in this nice, pretty green pen, to Taebyn, who is a good pup, exclamation point. And that was exciting.
Wow.
So it must be true.
It must be true.
Anyway, so when did you first realize you wanted to be a writer?
There were a number of points in my life. It wasn't a flash of lightning thing. It was more of a life kept giving me slaps across the face, and eventually I listened.
Oh, good for you.
Very early on, my mother taught English, and so would bring home these writing exercises and blank books and things. And so I would write little stories in the blank books, and mercifully, those have all been destroyed. But later on in college, I joined a science fiction group, and we decided we wanted to put out a magazine, and for a magazine we needed content, and so a bunch of us wrote stories, and I enjoyed writing stories, and people seemed to like the stories I wrote. And then it just never caught on, and then a few years out of college, when I started discovering furry fandom, I sent some stories off to furry zines, and they also seemed to like them. And then finally, it was some years after that I decided, well, here I am, I'm working in tech, but I really wanted to get better at writing. And I started taking some evening classes at a local college, writing workshop classes. And that's what really sort of pushed me to say, this is something not only that I like, but I enjoy the process of getting better at it. And I enjoy learning about it, and that it's something that I really want to do. And then happily, a few years after that, I got laid off. And my wonderful husband said, well, if you want to make a career out of this, I think this is the opportunity to do it.
So layoffs aren't usually a good thing, but I'm glad that this worked so much better than you ever could have thought of.
It did.
So what were those first furry zines that you submitted things to?
I'm pretty sure I sent something to Yarf, if you remember Yarf. That's
I've
an
heard of
old
Yarf.
school.
Okay.
It was one of the most successful zines that wasn't an APA, that wasn't like restricted membership. I think Yarf put out like 50 issues, and it was the taken to Kinko's and staple perfect bound with the tape along the edge kind of issues, but like that was what we had back in the day. So that one was definitely one that was accepted. There was at least one other one, and I can't remember now. It's been so long. And then I started working with Sofa Wolf Press. I co-founded Sofa Wolf Press, and because I had a story and Yarf wasn't responding to emails, and so I was talking to Jeff, who was the other founder, and said, I've got this story, and he read it and said, I really like it, and I've been thinking about putting together a zine. So Anthrolations was Sofa Wolf's first zine, and I have stories in that.
I'll have to go back and look and see if I can find your early works of art. And do you ever go back and look at your first things and compare them to what you do now and think, oh, wow, really?
I have avoided putting the first trilogy I wrote on audiobook, partly because it's hard to find a narrator who will read 3 adult furry novels, but also because then I would have to listen to all of those words that I wrote 15-ish years ago. I feel like that would be a painful experience.
It's good when we can avoid our own self-pain. So those were your first submissions to zines. When was your first actual novel?
So my first novel was Vol, which was published in 2005. and that grew out of a short story that I published in Heat. It was serialized over Heat issues 1 and 2. The novel came out in 2005, and that was Vol, and then Pendant of Fortune came out the next year, and then The Prisoner's Release, which was a collection of stories that included a novel-length story in it, and actually comes between the other two books, came out the year after that.
This actually hits on a question I have in the near future, but I'm going to hit it now. I've read Vol and half of Prisoner's Release. I guess that means I've read your first novel. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you just said, and it's been, I guess, kind of confusing for me. At first, I tried really hard to figure out which was actually the second one. Like, which should I read after Vol? And somehow I came across that I should read Prisoner's Release.
That's correct.
Okay, so I am doing it in the right order.
Yes.
Good for me.
Yeah, Prisoner's Release was the short story, and Vol was the prequel to the short story, and then Pendant of Fortune is the novel that comes after the short story. So those two novels got published first, and then I went back and wrote a bunch of side stories in the universe and packaged them together with the original short story and published that. So they were published in not the correct reading order. I think my Wikifur page has a good chronological list of the order that all of those books take place in, if people are looking for that.
We now know exactly how the Vol series should be read,
Yes.
although we can go to Wikifur too and find that out.
Or my own website.
Or like there are so many places. Since we're on Vol, then when people ask me, oh, hey, what's this Vol novel about? And I tell them, well, it's a gay, furry, medieval spy story. And they're like, oh, how does that even work? How would you describe the Vol series to some fur that's wanting to get into it and know more about it?
I don't know if I could improve on gay, furry, medieval spy story. That's pretty good overall. At the time that I wrote that, there was a division or perceived division in the fandom where you could write good books that had plot and story, or you could write short stories that had sex in them. There was a widely held perception that you couldn't have both. That if you wrote a book that had sex in it, then it was just for the sex. And if you wrote a book that had story in it, you couldn't put like explicit sex in it. And being a fox, I'm a little bit of a contrarian. And so if someone tells me that I can't do something that I think seems reasonable, then I'm more motivated to do it. Not like, hey, you can't climb that electrified fence. I'm happy not to do that. But if someone says you can't write a good book that also has sex in it, then if I think, I bet I can write a good book that also has sex in it, then that's what I'm motivated to do. The pacing is probably a little off in that first book, but in general, it's an adult gay romance set in a medieval fantasy world with furries.
What inspired the Vol character?
All of my characters are a little bit me. Where he came from specifically was the short story where I had the idea of a prisoner who had some information and a guard that was supposed to get it out of him, and that they would end up falling in love. And because I was dating a handsome white wolf at the time, I made the characters a fox and a white wolf. That's kind of where they came from.
Yeah, I really like this. Really great. Looking forward to reading more about more of the stuff.
Just in case this is of interest, I'm currently serializing on my Patreon and eventually will publish another novel set in that world that does not involve any of the same characters so far, except for some of the side characters here and there.
Oh, really?
And is not a medieval spy story, but is more of a gay romance with thieves and lords, and is, I guess I don't want to say more realistic, but the main character is a simple farmer, so there's a lot more about people with a lack of power in the world. Social power is something that I think everybody's become much more aware of, specifically in the past few months and years.
Hits on like real life and everything. So that's what you mean by...
Yeah, or at least an analogy to real life, lessons that can be taken away from it.
You can be entertained and learn. You heard it here first or second. How many novels overall have you published?
I have 22 standalone novels, and I'm including Prisoner's Release in that, even though it's technically a collection of stories, but one of the stories is novel length, so I'm gonna count it. I have 7 standalone novellas, which are stories under 50,000 words, and I've published 4 collections of my own stories, not counting the free collection that's an ebook only thing.
That's a lot of time spent right there.
It is.
How long does it take you to write a full novel then?
It really depends on the novel and how long I've been thinking about it and how much I plotted out in advance and how comfortable I am with the world. The latest Out of Position book, which came out last year, I think, I was writing it like very, very fast because I know the world, I know the characters, and it sailed right along because I knew what I wanted to say and I was just getting the words down. And so that went very quickly. But I had to think about it for several months. I think I saw that I had a year between the first time I started thinking about the outline and when I started actually writing it.
Oh, wow.
But once I started writing it, it was a little over a year from starting the first draft to publication. I think the fastest I've ever written a book was under a year when I came back from an FWA with an idea for a book to come out at the following FWA and outlined it and wrote it and got it published in time.
Good for you.
But on the other hand, the first book in the Collations series, which I'm writing under a different name, Tower and the Fox, I thought about for 7 years, and I did 2 completely different drafts. Not completely different, but I rewrote the whole story from scratch after writing it once. That took a while. But then the rest of them in the series, as I've become more comfortable with the world and knowing where I want to go with it, the rest of them have all been done within a year.
So it's a process, just like everything. It's a process. It sounds like, of course, it really helps to take your time, like preparing and doing an outline and, doing some kind of outline work before you actually start in on it.
Definitely. That saves so much time. It's so helpful for me to know where I'm going with the story, because if I don't, then I have to sit there and spend some of my writing time each day figuring it out.
I imagine you could easily go astray, and then the next day you realize, what was I thinking? And then you have to just redo it anyway.
Yeah, sometimes that happens. The serialized story on Patreon is one that I've sort of vaguely plotted out, but I also just write a little bit each week and keep building on what came before. And it seems to be going in a good direction, so I'm pretty pleased about it.
We'll be excited to check it out. So you really already mentioned this. So writing is your full-time job, is that right?
That's correct.
What's your schedule like? Do you sit down, say 9 to 5 or something, and just write, or do you just write when you feel inspired?
One of the things that having writing be your full-time job means is that you can't wait to be inspired. If you waited to be inspired, then you wouldn't get things done as quickly as you need to get them done.
That's a good point.
You have to be able to sit down and do the work. I end up sitting down between 9:30 and 10 at the computer. I'll go for about 4 hours in the morning, take a break for lunch, and then come back for another maybe 3 hours in the afternoon. Sometimes, some days I sit down and I spend the first hour and a half to 2 hours just trying to get that momentum going again. I've had a lot of days where I'd start off and I'd say I need to get to 1,500 words before I break for lunch, and I'll write 500 words in the first 3 hours and then 1,000 in the last one.
Again, it's that pacing thing. You just never know what's going to happen.
Right. And it's a lot of times if you haven't spent the time thinking about the story, then you have to do that when you sit down. And so over the last few years, myself and a lot of other writers that I've talked to have had this problem that there are so many other things occupying our minds that it's really hard to spend the time away from the computer thinking about your story, because it seems almost trivial at times compared to other things that you could and should be thinking about. So you sit down at the computer and you're like, okay, well, now I have to do the work to figure out where I'm going next. And then I have to actually write down what I'm going to do.
Definitely. It takes time to like switch gears in whatever you're doing, for sure.
Absolutely.
So, Kyell, you mentioned that you had taken some classes on how to write. Did the things you learned in class help you now, or have you thrown that out the window and just have your own methodology?
They've helped a lot. They have actually turned into things that I've incorporated into our classes that we teach in our workshop. The most helpful thing that I learned from the evening classes was how to critique. That's helpful because it not only makes you a better colleague to other writers, but also because it helps you look more critically at your own work. You can see problems more objectively in things that someone else is doing because you don't know all of the framework behind it, which is always there in anything you've written. When you see someone else making, oh, this mistake, I see that they're not supporting this enough. Then when you go back to your own work, you can say, oh, wait, I thought that this was clear, but it's actually not. This looks familiar from this other thing that I did 5 years ago now, I think. And we started a workshop for furry writers, and one of the main things that we teach in the workshop is critiquing.
That sounds like a deeper level of, how the thing where if you read your own whatever you wrote, you don't see all the spelling errors or easy grammar errors or something, and you give it to someone else. And of course they see it because it's a fresh eye. So this sounds like a deeper level of having someone else go in at a more deeper cognitive level to evaluate. And then you can take that information back and look at your own work through a different eye.
Right. Learning to look at your own work more objectively is something that's really helpful to do as a writer. The last proofreading pass that I do before I send a book off to the publisher is that I'll read the book aloud, because that forces me to slow down and be aware of each word, be aware of when I'm using a word too much in a paragraph, which still happens. I still, like when I go through on this final pass, this thing's been edited a bunch of times by a bunch of people, and I'll still go through and I'll find places where this conversation starts in one place and then jumps to another place. And in my head, it was perfectly clear what they were talking about. But when I read it aloud, I realize like, oh, this doesn't follow from that. I need to put something else in there, or I need to change these things around. So, and even then, like even with that, things make it out into the final books that sometimes I wish I could take back. But the process is pretty good now. I'm generally pretty happy with how the books come out.
What was one of the most surprising things you've learned while writing a book?
One of the things that comes to mind, I wrote, again, this was under my other name, but I wrote the New Tibet series, where the premise was there was this planet where the only habitable landmass was Arctic. And so all these Arctic furry species go there. And it was a gold rush kind of situation where they thought it's a new planet. If you get there, you can lay your claim to land and you can own land and mineral rights and then like extract the things. But what people didn't realize was that all the land was bought up by corporations. And so when they got there, all they could get was basically minimum wage jobs, and they couldn't save up enough money to buy a ticket off the planet. So everyone was basically wage slaves on this ice planet. And after I had written a story and put out a collection, or in the process of editing the collection, this was many years ago, I don't actually remember, I found out that basically exact thing happened in Siberia. People would go up there on the trains because they heard that there was opportunity. And then when they got there, they couldn't afford to get a train back. And so they were just stuck in these Siberian towns. This was in the early 19th century, I want to say, at some point when they had trains going up there, maybe mid-19th century, maybe mid-20th century. But yeah, it's funny when you think this feels like a thing that could happen that people would do to each other. And then you find out like, yep, absolutely.
Yep. Nothing new there.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite book? And why is it your favorite book?
Of mine or of someone else's?
How about of yours first?
My favorite book is always the most recent one I've done because I feel like it's the best thing. So right now, like the last thing I sent off to the publisher was the final book in the collation series called The Revolution and the Fox. I think that has a lot of really neat stuff in it. I'm very excited by it. It's always a challenge to end a series because you not only have to write a book that works well on its own, but you have to write a book that incorporates the ideas and themes and everything from all of the other books before it, and that then ties them all up nicely at the end also. So I like that one. I like Camouflage, which is a standalone novel. I keep coming back to that. It has neat fantasy elements and some spiritual elements. It looks down on the institution of religion while allowing for some positive spirituality to exist in the world. And also the magical fantasy elements in it are never really defined. It's a time travel story, but it's not a science fiction one. It's a character falls in a river and emerges 500 years earlier, and you're never sure whether it is really happening or if it's just he knocked himself out and he's having a hallucination. And as someone who was trained with engineering training, I find it difficult to do magic systems or any kind of fantasy that doesn't follow like strict D&D rulebook guidelines. Like, well, in order to cast this fireball spell, you have to have exactly 6 mana points, and you gather 1 mana point per thing you've eaten or hour you've rested, and so you have to rest for 6 hours to be able So both the collation series, which has magic in it, and camouflage both have these elements of magic that I worked very hard to not define, to kind of push against my tendency to say magic is just science fiction. At this point, those come to mind.
So you mentioned other writers. Who's your favorite book from another writer?
The two living writers that I really, really admire and wish I could do anything as close to what they're doing. Kazuo Ishiguro, who wrote Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, and a bunch of other books. I have, I think, most of his books, if not all of them, and near all but one of them are fantastic reads. And even that one is really, really interesting. It just feels like a failed experiment, but it's interesting for the experimental nature of it. The other author is David Mitchell. There are a number of David Mitchells out there, but he's the one who wrote Cloud Atlas, which is probably one of my favorite books. It's great. But I also love all of his other books. Black Swan Green is a little less challenging to get into if people are looking to get into David Mitchell. Slade House is a really good horror novel that jumps around in time and stuff, and I am a fan of jumping around in time. So
Barely you've heard of some of those.
Oh, yes. I love Cloud Atlas. I loved the various movie versions of it, and I've read the book, and it's I agree with you 100%.
the Cloud Atlas movie is surprisingly good as an adaptation of a very difficult book to adapt. I would recommend it.
You just said you just sent off a book to the publisher, and are you at a break then, or do you have some ideas for something to start working on, or maybe you're already working on something?
I've always got several projects. I have a file on my computer somewhere that has a list of upcoming novels that I want to write. So right now, I finished a draft of a sequel to the novella Dude, Where's My Fox, which is also fun. I mean, like when I talk about favorite books, I really like how that one turned out too. And I just got the chance to revisit it because the audiobook narrator just finished doing the first version of it. So hopefully we'll have that up by sometime this year, depending on how quickly Audible moves on it. So I just finished that sequel. So that's another novella. I'm working on the Patreon story, as I said. I'm working on another story for my higher tier Patreon subscribers. And next week, I'm going to be attending an online writing workshop which is cool because I've been wanting to go back to this workshop for a while, and I can never do it when it's in person. But now because everything's online, I can sit at my desk for a week and join in with these people. And I have a book project that I'm going to be working on with them. Then I have another book project to do when I'm finished with that. And I have another book that I wrote for my Patreon last year that I still haven't worked on getting out to a publisher. And I have another book series that I started, and I wrote the first book like 3 years ago, and it didn't quite feel ready, so I haven't done anything with it, but it's getting close to the point where I feel like I should revisit that.
Wow.
I'm sure by the time all those are done, I will have gotten like 4 more ideas for books. So
It's a never-ending process then. You're always doing stuff.
Yep.
What makes a good story? You have all these things and all these different ideas and all these different types of books and things. In your mind, what makes a good story?
So for me, all of this is, my particular viewpoint, my experience. What makes a good story for me might not make a good story necessarily for someone else. At a basic level, a good story involves a character or characters whom the reader is at least interested in hanging out with because they're going to be hanging out with them for a while. And that doesn't mean they have to like them. It can just mean they're interested in what they're going to do next, or they find them curious, or they think, oh, that's an interesting character. So it involves an interesting character who wants something and needs to go through some obstacles and some self-realizations in order to get what they want. When I teach short story workshops, I boil it down to have a good setting, have a good character, have the character want something, and then have something preventing them from getting what they want.
Sounds like a good baseline.
That's the basic formula. For me, I really love furry characters, so for me to want to write a story, it probably should have some kind of furry character in it because I like the aesthetic, and that's why I write furry novels, and hopefully I write for people who also like that aesthetic, but there are people who don't. I think if you can put some interesting world building into it, then that's also something that can make for a really attractive story at the base of it. I think that's what it is.
So you mentioned about the outside the furries. Do you find you have a fan base outside the furry fandom at all, or do you know?
A little bit. The
Okay.
Out of Position series won the first book won some gay romance awards, and So my name gets out into gay romance circles. And for a while, people were reading the out of position books and leaving comments like, this should be weird, but somehow it's not. Which is still one of my favorite reviews I've ever gotten. So there are definitely gay romance people who read my stuff. There are some science fiction and fantasy people who also read my stuff. I know some people in that community under this name or different names, but some of them also read my stuff. So a little bit outside the furry fandom. It would be nice to have more, but I don't necessarily want to write non-furry stuff in an effort to attract non-furry fans. I'd rather just make everyone furry.
Duh.
Right?
Right? At least in the beginning, you didn't, like all the illustrations in your books are primarily other wonderful artists. Shout out to them. Are you an artist? Do you ever do any of your own artwork in your books?
I do not. One of the fantastic things about the furry fandom, and there are many, is that we have so many talented artists. Why would I subject people to my untalented scrawlings when for a few $100 I can pay someone to do some gorgeous art?
Yeah.
But more than that, I actually really like collaborating with artists. I like someone else reading the story and putting out their interpretations of the characters, telling me what scenes resonated with them and what they feel like they want to illustrate. That's really fun for me. I like working with other people.
So that's cool. So you let them decide what speaks to them. You don't say, oh, I want a picture at this point in the book, but you let them say, okay, well, this part of the story spoke to me and I have this vision for what it looks like. So you let them do that.
For the most part, there's a little bit of collaboration. Sometimes, usually what I'll do is I'll write to them and ask if they want to read the book. Almost always they do. And then I'll say, what scenes do you feel like you want to illustrate? Because what I found, what I think many people, because we all interact with artists and get commissions of one thing or another, what I find is if you let the artist have some agency in the commission, if you say like, this is my character, but put him in a situation that you find interesting, or like, what kind of things do you like to draw? Fine, draw my character doing that. Then I think in general you get better art because their passion can come through, as opposed to you'll get perfectly fine art if you dictate out all of the details of a commission, and maybe because the good professional artists can find ways to be passionate and engaged with things they're told how to do. But I just think it's more fun if the artist is like, oh, these things are things that I really want to illustrate, and then we'll have a little back and forth. Sometimes there's a scene that I really think is important, and I'll say, well, what about this scene? And they'll say, oh yeah, and then we'll have to talk about it a bit because maybe they couldn't figure out a way to get into that scene. So I get a list from them, and then I go back and say, well, these all seem great, and maybe also these two things. And then we have a discussion about it. We talk about things like, because sometimes you'll go through all the scenes and you'll be like, these are the 10 or 7 or 5 scenes that we want to illustrate. And you're like, oh, that character's not in any of them, but I really want them to get drawn. And then you have to figure out, maybe we compromise and say, well, like, this scene isn't as important, but it does have that character in it. It's definitely a collaborative process, and it's always fun for me to see the results.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. And it's more special for them too. If they're like, they feel like they actually have a stake in it. It's not like someone's telling them to draw something. They're actually, kind of a part of the process and the story in a way. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah. As much as we can do that, I always try to do that.
Furcas has been an artist for some of your stuff, hasn't she?
For many of my books, yes.
Okay.
Furcas is great. I admire her greatly as an artist and as a writer too. She wrote a standalone book called Heretic, a trilogy called Off the Beaten Path. She's written a 2-part series called Legacy, and I worked with her on the new books that are coming out. I actually went through and did some editing. Really enjoy. She has really good story instincts, and that's a bonus when you get an artist that also has story instincts, because then she'll go through my work when she's figuring out what scenes to draw. And also she might say, this part didn't seem to work. She's very deferential with her feedback a lot of the time, but I do value getting it.
She's really great. And she's one of the only other authors that I've read. I've read Heretic and The Legacy. And in fact, we're having her on the show in a few weeks.
Oh, that's
actually.
Awesome.
So I'm looking forward to talking to her too. And I'm sure I'll ask her things about illustrating for you or something.
I talked about her writing, but also as an artist, she's professional. She's very talented. She's never missed a deadline for me. She's never fallen out of touch. She's always come through with just fantastic interpretations of the characters. She illustrated the Dangerous Spirits series. She illustrated Camouflage. Her cover for Camouflage is one of my favorites. She illustrated my Love Match series, and she stepped in towards the end of the Out of Position series when we had to juggle some artists around, and she actually illustrated or collaborated on the last 2 books that came out. So yeah, I've worked with her a lot.
Let me ask a question, Taebyn. So, other than being a guest on a small-time podcast like ours, is there anything strange or interesting that's happened to you because you're a well-known author in the furry fandom?
I've been recognized in an airport.
Really?
I was on my way to a furry convention, but the person who recognized me was not. It wasn't just a case of like, hey, we're all going to whatever convention it was. Because there's definitely like when MFF rolls around, if you live in a big city and you're going to the airport any of the 2 days, like Wednesday or Thursday, you'll probably see other furries at your gate.
There's a good chance.
I was talking to some people in the science fiction community, and one guy was like, oh yeah, I'm reading a furry book. And I debated whether I was going to say anything, and I was like, okay, what book is it? I probably know the author, and it was one of my books that he was reading. So that was also interesting.
Do you accept short stories from other budding authors to review?
I sadly do not. I barely have time to read all the things that I want to read. I could show you one of my 3 books to read piles that are scattered around this room. Honestly, most of the time I'm sitting down at the computer, I'm trying to write my own stuff, so I generally don't. I have 2 writing groups that I work with. When I'm reading other people's stuff, it's usually for one of them. However, if you want me to read and critique your short story, I do teach at the workshop that I mentioned earlier, which we are trying to run every year. This year, for obvious reasons, we're not holding it. It's called RAWR, R-A-W-R. It stands for Residential Anthropomorphic Writers Retreat.
Nice.
It is about a week-long workshop where you will come and stay with 4 to 5 other writers. 2 instructors will help guide you through critiques, and you will write a story on site in that week, and we'll have lessons, and basically you get to bond with other people and just think about writing for an entire week. The website is rar.community. I encourage people to apply for the workshops, even though probably like everything's getting pushed back a year. So we might have like 1 or 2 slots for next year, but then the year after we're going to keep doing it. I think we've done 4. It's gotten enough momentum that it's a stable thing, and we're going to keep doing it. And it's one of the things I'm really proud of having been a part of and continuing to be a part of.
Yeah, that sounds like a really useful thing for budding artists, in this case of writing art. I guess on that note, do you have any tips for budding young fur authors?
I have so many tips. I have a book that I actually did not include in the tally of books that I listed for you earlier because it is a nonfiction book of writing advice. It's called Do You Need Help? It is free on the Bad Dog Books website, which is the ebook arm of Fur Planet. And it's a collection of writing tips that I wrote over 4 or 5 years of writing my newsletter. My newsletter answers writing questions. If you want to get it, I email you a newsletter once a month. It has updates, it has excerpts, and it has writing tips in it. I tweet about it usually every month when it comes out. But in general, read as much as you can, write as much as you can, get into the habit of writing, learn how to evaluate your own writing, and be stubborn and be patient. Because as I said, when we talked about like starting out, I started out writing some stories and then I fell away from it. And then I wrote some more stories in college and then I fell away from it. And then I started writing some more serious things. And it was years after college that my first novel was published. I don't want to say how many, but it was more than 10. And then I published 3 novels before I published Waterways, which was the first thing that I published that was really successful. And then it was another year until I published Out of Position, which was the most successful thing that I've published. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while, and it can be really frustrating when you don't get the success that you see other people getting, and when you are learning how to evaluate your own writing and you're seeing, oh, I'm not as good as this person, I'm not as good as this person, I'm not as good as this person. And it can be frustrating because you can't see how you'll ever be as good because you're always doing the best you can at that moment, but you can keep learning. And everybody who is successful went through that period where they thought they weren't going to ever be as good as they eventually got.
And I think that applies to like a lot of things too, for whatever you furs out there might be trying to do or trying to get better at. Just keep with it, keep doing it. If you love it, just keep doing it for yourself, for the fun, for the experience. I think we know that part of this. Where can we find all your work? Like websites and social media and things like that.
My website is kyellgold.com, KYELLGOLD.com. I don't update it as often as I should, but most of the information on there is static. The thing I had to update most often was convention appearances, and then I don't have to update that for a while. So I've basically left it alone, but I need to go back and put the new books in there. But it has a list of all of my books that came out as of probably a few months ago. It's reasonably current. My main social media outlet these days is Twitter, where I'm just at Kyell Gold. I tweet there a bunch. My alternate Twitter identity is at WriterFox. That's where I tweet more about the Collations books and the New Tibet stuff and the science fiction-y kind of world thing. You can find my books on furplanet.com and sofawolf.com. Those are my two primary publishers in the furry fandom, and if you buy from them, then most of your money stays in the furry fandom, which is really nice. You can find my ebooks at baddogbooks.com, which is Fur Planet's ebook store, again, keeping money in the fandom. If for whatever reason you don't want to or can't shop there, almost everything that I have is on Amazon Kindle, and I still get a good chunk of money from that, so it's fine. It's just you're also giving money to Amazon then. Also on iTunes and Kobo and Google Play. Go search any place that sells books. And also I have audiobooks out, about a dozen of them maybe, and those are on Audible and iTunes. And again, just search my name and you'll find them.
Cool. Yeah. So we're kind of winding down our time with you. I know that I promised you it would only take about an hour, and we're just about that hour mark. So before we leave, is there anything you would like, any words of wisdom that you would like to impart to the 4, maybe 5 listeners we have now?
We might have 5
in the furry fandom.
I mean, I think if people are listening to your show, they're already probably up there on the wisdom scale. So I don't know what I could add to that.
Well, you're so nice.
I think, I don't know. I used to, when I did a podcast regularly, I would go on little rants about how great the furry fandom is. And I still think that. And I think that if I were to tell anyone, like new furries coming into the fandom or people who have been here a long time, it's just keep making this our community, because we're the ones who get to decide what this is. We don't have to listen to anyone else. We have to treat each other with respect. And part of that is, there's something cool that you want to do, go do it. Again, as long as you're being respectful, as long as you're not harming other people, etc., etc. We have to put that caveat in now because of, but furry has continued to grow every year that I've been involved in it. And that is coming up on a large number of years, like way past being able to drink. My furry fandom experience is way past being able to drink, and is almost a gray muzzle. But every year it keeps growing, and part of the reason it keeps growing is because we encourage people to express themselves and be who they are. And so keep doing that.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. That's good. That's good advice for everybody. So Kyell, it's been wonderful having you on our show.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I've had a delightful time. I really enjoyed chatting with you guys.
Well, thank you.
Delighted and wag.
Oh, good. More wags.
Well, Kyell, thanks for joining us.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right.
Thank you again for having me on.
All right. Take care.
That was so cool.
That was so cool to talk to him. I learned a lot about the writing process and about all of the other things that he does. He's a very prolific writer. I didn't realize he had so many books. I'm going to have to read all of them now.
All of them in one night. Yeah, I knew he had a lot. I didn't know he had that much, but yeah, and he's a great guy. Lots of fun to talk to. Really nice. I hope to see him at a con sometime.
All right. Well, Taebyn, we're going to buzz past because we have taken a lot of everybody's time tonight.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for listening. All 4, maybe 5 of you.
Maybe 5 of you now. So, but we're going to move into our final segment of the day, and that is, of course, This or That.
Or that time.
All right. So my first this or that for you is sandals or sneakers.
Well, this pup actually has some sandals. My posies don't like sneakers too much because it keeps my fluff all together and then I don't feel good. So I'm gonna have to go with sandals. They let my fluff flow.
Let the fluff flow. That's
It
nice.
sounds very 60s of me.
It's very. Do you remember the 60s?
I wasn't even. I mean, that was like a long time before I was born. But from what I understand, that's a very 60s thing.
Very
I
60s
don't know.
thing.
I don't know.
Okay. All right. So, if you're at a movie,
hmm
do you prefer candy or popcorn?
Popcorn. I love the popcorn because you got the butter on it and stuff, and it's so numb and fun. And then you just keep eating it, and it's okay because it's popcorn. So like, it doesn't. You can have dinner afterwards. It doesn't matter how much popcorn you had because it's popcorn. It's like air.
It's like
Butter
air.
on. It's buttered air.
Buttered air. Wow. Why not just have a handful of butter?
Well, because then my pussy gets all like all buttery, and then I have to take a shower, and then I have to dry off, and then I'm fluff again. But that's a lot of work.
All right. All right. I understand that. So, now this is going to be deep.
Oh
Fire or ice? Ooh.
well. Actually, I'm
Shall I
I'm at
repeat the question?
I think I'm at a loss for words, and that doesn't happen to this pup very often. I don't know. I mean, ice is pretty blue and everything, but it's cold. But of course, I have my posies to keep it from getting too cold. The fluff on my posies from getting too cold. So I think I'm gonna go with iced because it's pretty blue sometimes,
All right. Blue
and it
ice.
rhymes with nice,
Blue ice rhymes with nice.
and that's just the spice of life or something.
Awesome. Well, speaking of spices, do you prefer steak or chicken?
Speaking of spices, I prefer chicken. I definitely prefer chicken. I love me a good steak, but just if I'm gonna have to eat one of those over and over and over again, I'm gonna go with chicken.
And chicken it will be.
Chicken it will be.
Chicken it will be because crispy chicken and nummy nummy tot tots.
See, and that's really the reason, right?
Absolutely, it's got to be the reason because it's not crispy steak and nummy nummy French fries.
No, that just does not roll off the tongue.
It does not. It does not. Okay, Taebyn. Well, we have had a lot of fun today. We've had a lot of learned a lot with Kyell, and we thank everyone for listening. We love each and every one of you.
Each and every one of you.
I know we didn't have time for the 5-minute furs for fun today. Hopefully, we'll be able to have to do that next week. We will have to see, but we'll try. And with our guests coming in, our guests lately they have a lot of stuff that they want to impart to us. Ooh, that's a big word. Impart.
That was a big word.
Impart knowledge. Who knew you were going to learn stuff on the Barely Furcasting featuring
No, I
Taebyn
sure
podcast?
did. This pup did not.
All right. Well, remember you can subscribe, like and subscribe, ring the bell, all that other kind of stuff.
And leave a comment on the website and stuff. Let us know what you think about things.
Absolutely. Let us know what you think. Ask us if you'd like to suggest topics for us to discuss. Please feel free to do so. We enjoy getting the information and the feedback. It's a lot of fun to read stuff and interact with our fans. And just for those that might be listening, we did set up a new Telegram channel for budding podcasters to go on and talk about their podcast and talk about get some tips and pointers and things like that to help out those that are trying to be a podcaster. Not that Taebyn and I are any professionals with this. You are now listening to our 11th podcast.
11th.
And we kind of did this on a whim, a shoestring, and a prayer. But I figured and a fluff. And if we have time to help others out and impart our knowledge, what we've learned so far, please engage us in conversation. So with that, we will see you. Not see you, but you will hear us.
You next. Yes.
You will hear us. We won't hear you, but you will hear us next week.
You can yell at your computer if you want. We just won't hear you.
That's right. You will hear us again next week, and thanks for joining us. Have a great week.
Bark, bark.
Barely Furcasting is an Injured Nerves studio production. It is found on all major podcast platforms and can also be listened to directly at barelyfurcasting.com. All opinions expressed here are those of Taebyn and Barely, and neither received any commercial compensation for their opinions. The Furcast is recorded and edited by me, Barely Normal, also known as Mike Began. Opening, interstitial, and closing music by Shane Ivers through silvermansound.com. If you would like to send us a message, you can do so via email at barelyfurcasting@gmail.com or on Telegram chat at BFFTchat. Additionally, Taebyn can be reached on social media at TaebynPup on YouTube and Twitter. Thanks for listening. We hope to see you back here next week.